We've looked the first week at the overview of the book of Ruth, what purpose that it serves, and we said the book of Ruth is a love story, but maybe not a love story in the way that sometimes is portrayed. It's a love story about a covenantal love, and it's showing us through Ruth's love for her mother-in-law Naomi, it's showing us God's love for his people. God's covenant love, his loyal love. That even when Naomi is at her lowest, even when she can't see the value in herself, Ruth never leaves her, and Ruth proves faithful to her. And we see God's love for his people that way. And then we see God's ultimate plan for his people in Boaz, in one that would redeem both Naomi and her family and Ruth as well, which ultimately leads to the ultimate Redeemer, not just for Israel, but for the whole world and for ourselves, and that is Jesus Christ. We also see the entrance of a closer kinsman that could be a nearer Redeemer, which ends up not able to redeem Naomi and Ruth and their family. So Boaz becomes the ultimate redeemer. Last week we saw chapters 1 and 2 and the backstory in chapter 1 of how Naomi, her husband Elimelech, and their family, because of a famine, they moved down into Moab, where her sons take wives of Moabite women. The sons and Elimelech die, leaving Naomi and her two daughters-in-law by themselves. Naomi urges the daughter-in-laws to go back to their own families in Moab. One of them, Orpah, she does return back to her home. Ruth decides to stay with Naomi and go back to Bethlehem, where she will become a part of the community there in Bethlehem. Where Naomi goes, she will go. Where Naomi lives, she will live. Naomi's people will be her people. Naomi's God will be her God. And where Naomi dies, that's where Ruth will die. And so we find that Ruth and Naomi make their way back to Bethlehem, but they are widowed and poor. And so Ruth, to provide for the family, goes to glean in the fields. And remember, she just so happens to come upon the field of Boaz, who is a kin of Naomi and Elimelech. And Ruth finds favor in Boaz's eyes. And Boaz makes many provisions for her, telling the servants to, even they're gleaning the fields or when they're harvesting the fields, even to lay extra behind so Ruth can have it. And she brings back so much to Naomi that Naomi is surprised and finds out the field that Naomi or Ruth has been gleaning in is the field belonging to Boaz, who is a near kinsman. So Naomi tells Ruth to stay in that field, to stay close to Boaz's people. And all this time, after Naomi finds out this piece of information, she now begins to devise a plan in her mind of how Boaz can now become a redeemer for Ruth and for Naomi herself. And that's where we begin in chapter 3. In chapter 3, we begin here with the plan, and then the proposal, and then we find the revelation of a nearer kinsman, and then we see the scene there. But as we go to chapter 3, we're basically going to see here in chapter 3 the plan and the proposal that we find in verses 1 through 11. So as we come into chapter 3, notice on the top of our paper, we find we slow down the narrative because we've gone through the whole harvest season, several months, as Ruth is in the fields gleaning behind the other women in Boaz's field. So we slow down the narrative to a climatic evening on the threshing floor. The time for winnowing the barley is here, and Boaz is winnowing with his winnowing fork in the threshing floor at the end here of the barley harvest. And so Naomi is devising a plan. It's a risky plan for Ruth, But what she seeks for Ruth, as we see in verse number 1, Naomi, her mother-in-law, says to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you?" So she's seeking rest, or literally a resting place, a place of security for Ruth. And this place of rest would come in the form of a marriage to Boaz. So there are 3 scenes to this chapter in Ruth chapter 3. The first 5 verses is the preparation for the marriage. Verses 6 through 15, Ruth's marriage proposal on the threshing floor. And then 16 and 17, the early morning back at home. As we look into the first 5 verses, of course, the first verse, Naomi is seeking rest for Naomi, or for Ruth. Number 2, verse number 2 says, "Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? Is winnowing barley in the threshing floor." So she tells Ruth in verse number 3 to wash, therefore, anoint yourself, put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, "All that you said, I will do." So this is the plan. The plan is to wash, to get ready, to anoint yourself, put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor where Boaz has been winnowing barley all day. And at the end of the day, he's going to be tired. He's going to have a meal and something to drink, and then he's going to lie down and go to sleep. And she tells Ruth to wait until he's finished working, wait until he's had something to eat, he's had something to drink, and he's ready to lay down and sleep for the night. And when he does, sneak into the threshing floor and lay down at his feet, uncover his feet, and then just wait for him to wake up and be surprised. So she's got this whole plan devised of how Ruth's going to reveal herself to Boaz. So after this plan, Ruth does what Naomi tells her. And so she goes down through the threshing floor in verse 6 through 11. Here's the actual marriage proposal. Verse number 6, "So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and had drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of a heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And at midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he says, 'Who are you?' And she answered, 'I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer.' So Boaz turns over in his sleep, is startled by a woman laying in his bed, asks who she is, and Ruth makes it clear with her first words to Boaz. If you notice here on your paper, she says, 'I am Ruth, your handmaid.' There are actually a couple of words for servant. One is used earlier as like a common servant. This literally is your handmaid. Not just any old servant, but a servant of a more elevated status. Basically, this servant in an elevated status has the ability to marry and to become a wife, more than just a servant. So it's a handmaid with the potential to be a wife. And that's the word that Ruth uses here, a different word than is used earlier on in describing her. And she tells Boaz here, "Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." So Ruth proposes marriage to Boaz here, instead of it being the other way around. And then we find in verse number 10, Boaz's response. He says, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." So basically, again, what Boaz has been impressed with this whole time is Ruth's kindness to Naomi. Ruth's kindness to Naomi. He mentioned that before when she said, "Why have I found such favor in your sight?" He says, "Well, because of how good you've treated your mother-in-law. And that God is repaying you back for how good and how kind you've been to her." And now, as Ruth proposes marriage to Boaz, notice he says, "May you be blessed of the Lord. You've made this lasting kindness greater than the first." So she didn't come back to Bethlehem and say, "Okay, so I'm going to find a young, guy myself and marry him and go off," or, she remains in her proposal to Boaz. She's remaining faithful to Naomi. Because it's not just her marriage to Boaz for Ruth's sake. It's Boaz will be a redeemer for Naomi and for Naomi's family and for Naomi's lineage. So he says, you didn't go after all these younger men. You didn't, whether rich or poor. You came to me to redeem your mother-in-law. And this act of kindness is so great. So again, Boaz is commending her and even says, you have a reputation among the others in the town that you are a worthy woman. You are a worthy woman. So that is the proposal. So she proposes marriage for Boaz to be a redeemer, and he welcomes that proposal. However, now we find that there is a little bump in the road to Boaz redeeming Naomi and Ruth and marrying Ruth. And that is revealed in verse number 12. So in verses 12 through 15, a nearer kinsman than Boaz is known or is made known. So he says in verse number 12, "And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer who is nearer than I." He tells her, "Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So either Naomi wasn't aware of this fact, that there was a nearer redeemer, or it's something she forgot or conveniently overlooked because of Boaz's stellar reputation in the community. But Boaz reveals there's a closer relative, and it's his duty to actually redeem the family property. But now he tells Ruth to remain there while he goes the next day in order to take care of this. Verse 14, so she lay at his feet till morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing, hold it out." He measured it and put 6 measures of barley in it, and she went into the city. She comes back home to Naomi. And Naomi wants to know, of course, her first question is, how did it go? So in verse 16, when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" And she told her all that the man had done for her. And saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me and said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law." She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle this matter today." So Naomi's anticipating this is going to get taken care of quickly. And so it does. In chapter 4, as we find Ruth has proposed marriage. Boaz is welcome to a proposal, but the matter has to be taken care of this nearer kinsman than Boaz. So Boaz here, we find in chapter 4, is going to meet this nearer kinsman. And he's preparing for this transaction. And the scene that we're going to see gives insight of how legal agreements were made back in the ancient world. The last act consists of 3 scenes. Boaz convenes a legal assembly. There are 2 exchanges with the nearer kinsman, and then 1 exchange with the elders, wherein Boaz acquires Ruth and becomes the redeemer. So this shows us how transactions are are taken care of in the ancient days. So the first thing that we see here in chapter 4, verse 1, Boaz goes up to the city gate and sits down at the city gate. The city gate or the town gate is where transactions would take place, right out in the open in front of witnesses. So it's the equivalent of a city hall where people would go and do business. And so he goes up to the gate and he sits down at the gate, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz has spoken came by. So Boaz says, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and he sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling," and this is the first we find out about this, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. So the first thing that Boaz says here is that Naomi has this parcel of land that she's widowed, that will end up being no good to her and will be passed on as well. So she's selling it, and she's giving this nearer kinsman a chance to buy it. And so the nearer kinsman is like, sure, a piece of property, a piece of land in our family's name, sure, I'll buy it. I will redeem it. Now here comes the swerve. Here comes the condition in verse number 5. There's a condition attached to the parcel of property. Verse 5, then Boaz says, oh, by the way, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. So with the parcel of property, you also have the obligation to marry and take Ruth the Moabite to be your wife, to redeem the name of the family. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So obviously in marrying Ruth, there is some risk involved in all these legal family matters that they have here in ancient Israel. And this Redeemer is not willing to obviously sacrifice his own inheritance for redeeming Naomi and marrying Ruth. So this nearer kinsman says, I cannot redeem it for myself. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. And so willing to take the land, not willing to take Ruth, or cannot redeem Ruth. So with that, Boaz now has the okay to proceed with redeeming Naomi and marrying Ruth. So it points out in verses 7 and 12, this is how Boaz acquires Elimelech's property and Ruth. And it mentions the custom in Israel in exchanging and redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was a matter of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal, making this official. Then Boaz said to the elders of the people, you are witnesses this day. I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. And Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. And then they began to make a blessing over Ruth. So the transaction becomes official. Boaz removes his sandal gives it to the near kinsman, symbolic of this transaction and exchanging of the right to become the redeemer. And then it's done in front of the 10 elders and in front of the people in town. So there are witnesses. So everything is legal. Everything is binding. Then the people, the witnesses, announce a blessing over Ruth. And notice their blessing over Ruth. And this is amazing considering Ruth is a Moabite woman. They say, "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together build up the house of Israel." It's a big blessing. Maybe like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house, or the mothers of the house of Israel. "May you act worthily in Ephratah and be renowned in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So they are blessing Ruth, they are blessing the union and the future offspring. And maybe this was customary, or maybe little did they know what they were actually saying and how great of offspring that would come from this union of marriage. So the blessing of the people at the gate signifies, first of all, Ruth's acceptance. Acceptance. Linking her with Rachel and Leah. And with Tamar, the ancestress of the tribe of Judah. Ruth, in fact, not only becomes accepted herself in Israel, but becomes the mother, grandmother of the greatest king, David, and who would ultimately become the greatest of the greatest kings, Jesus. So what an amazing word this is from someone who should have never, even according to the law, should never have been accepted into the community of Israel. Not only is she accepted, she's blessed to become a mother of Israel as well. So what a wonderful scene here of Ruth's acceptance because of Boaz, her redeemer, which paints all kinds of pictures when you look at it through the lens of salvation. You have Naomi, who is a Jewish person, who has been redeemed by Boaz so that her family name would continue on. And then you have Ruth, for lack of a better term, a Gentile, so to speak, who's also redeemed by Boaz and would be accepted into the covenant family. And if that's not a picture of what Jesus did for the church made up of both Jew and Gentile, then I don't know what is. Jesus, being the ultimate redeemer, comes and offers salvation to the Jewish people. For Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the righteousness of God to the Jew first and also to the Gentile." The gospel was preached first to the Jews. On the day of Pentecost, 3,000 Jewish people were born again, were redeemed because of Jesus. So you have Jesus being the spiritual Boaz that redeems both Naomi, the Jewish people, and redeems Ruth, a Gentile, because the gospel is for the Jews and the Gentiles. And as we're told in the book of Romans, there's one covenant people of God symbolized by an olive tree, and those would be the believing Jews, and then the believing Gentiles would be grafted into the covenant family of God. And that's the picture of the church, made up of believing Jew and believing Gentile, both redeemed by Jesus Christ. And that's the picture we have here of Naomi the Jew, Ruth the Gentile, both being redeemed by Boaz. Ruth, coming into the family, gains total acceptance into the community of faith. And through Jesus, we are totally accepted into the covenant of God. We are made heirs of the Father, joint heirs with Jesus Christ. Those who are of faith, they are the children of Abraham. We are all the children of Abraham by faith in Christ Jesus, Galatians tells us. We've been totally accepted into the family of God, totally accepted by covenant. That's this picture here of Ruth's total acceptance and our total acceptance. So you see the picture here of the church. So the blessing we find here over Ruth and Boaz. Then in verses 13 through 17, or really verse 13 through the rest of the chapter, we find the marriage and the birth. Verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in unto her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. They wasted no time perpetuating the family lineage. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Now, the son would serve a couple of purposes. The first purpose is that it would continue on the family lineage. The second purpose is that it would bring about the monarchy of Israel. And the third purpose, very personal, and I love how God does this. I love how this is put in here. The purpose of the child is for Naomi. This would, in all intents and purposes, be Naomi's child. That's the inference that is inferred here. Verse 14, then the women said to Naomi, it's the same women probably that when Naomi came back, they're like, oh, this is Naomi. And Naomi's like, my name's not Naomi. Why are you calling me Naomi? Call me Mara because I'm bitter. And she like fusses all these women out like right when she comes back. And now the women say to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. Reading those words, I just like to read it. Blessed be the Lord who's not left you. Naomi, you thought he left you. You thought he brought about all this trouble in your life. Remember, Naomi, you went away full, but you came back empty. The Lord brought you back empty. That's what you said. But Naomi, blessed be the Lord, for he's not left you. He has not left you this day. With all that you've been through, he's not left you, and he's not left you this day. And he's not left you without a redeemer. He's not left you without a hope. He's not left you without a future. He's not left you, Naomi. So Naomi goes from full to empty, and now from empty back to full. And the women say, may his name be renowned in Israel. He will be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons. Naomi, she's more faithful to you than 7 sons. And 7's a word of completion, perfection, than all the sons you could ever have. She's better than all of them. For she's given birth to this one who's proof that God has not left you, who's proof that God has not left his people, who's proof that you have a future, who's proof that God loves you, Naomi. God's faithfulness. That's God's covenant love. Not that Naomi loved God, but that he loved her. When she was angry at God, he loved her. When she thought he left her, he loved her. When she didn't see anything good in herself, he loved her. Same way with Israel. It's not that Israel first loved God, it's that he first loved them. When they rebelled against him, he was faithful to them. When they left him, he didn't leave them. When they were lost, he sent a redeemer. That's God's love. Now you can take it a step further. When the world rebelled against God, God loved the world. When the world was lost, God loved the world and sent a redeemer to the world. How amazing is the steadfast, loyal love of God. That he was caring for the whole world in preparing a grandfather, a father to David, who would be a grandfather, a father to Jesus. How he was caring for Israel in giving them a king, David. How he cared for Naomi in a very personal, individual way. How he cared for Ruth, who in the law was written out, written off as a heathen people who deserved to be ran out of the land and slaughtered and not let into the covenant. But yet it shows that he cares even for the Moabite. How powerful is this picture and how powerful is this book of Ruth? So Naomi takes the child, lays it on her lap, and becomes his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." A son has been born to Naomi. So she acts and is a mother to this child. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Those words are huge in this story. Those words are huge considering everything we've looked at from Genesis 12 on through Judges. Remember in Judges there was no king in the land. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Nobody was ruling over the people. There was no prophetic voice like there had been in Moses and Joshua. But now we find these words of hope and future. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then we end in verses 18 through 20 with a genealogy, the generations of Perez. And then it goes on to list the genealogy of David, leading up to David in the monarchy. And that's what the book of Ruth is about. It's not how to find a husband. It's about how it's about how God, in his steadfast love, redeems his people. And how in the story of Israel is providing for them a king, David, his chosen one, his anointed one, that would ultimately lead to the ultimate king, his anointed one, his chosen one, Jesus. So that's the purpose of the book of Ruth and all its many implications that it has.